I'm going to start by saying that we really face, there's a three-pronged critique, in my view, of U.S. Foreign aid as it exists now. And the first one is the one you hear that I'll sort of, for laziness, call the conservative critique. Aid doesn't work. It's money down, quote, rat holes, unquote. It goes to people who are undeserving. It's a poor investment of U.S. resources. We should look out for ourselves, or if we have problems abroad, we should solve them with the military, which is immediate and effective, and not with this diffuse, wait 20 years and see what happens when the kid grows up kind of thing. And the truth is, some of our aid is pretty darn ineffective. Some of it has been counterproductive. Some of it is distorting. Some of it is promised to the American public that it'll do one thing and it does something else. So that critique is not entire. Sometimes aid is not, we promise that aid is the solution to a political problem, which it isn't. So that critique, although it's repugnant to me personally, it's framed in repugnant terms. It very often, I'm afraid, has some elements of prejudice attached to it, but it's not entirely wrong. You can't just wish it away and say that isn't true. Second, there's a critique from the left, both the American left and the global left, that says aid is actually, in its form and delivery, it is as oppressive as the conditions it seeks to remedy. It disempowers local governments, it distorts local economies, it perpetuates post-colonial control over the societies to which aid is given. And this critique would say it's too tied to U.S. foreign policy goals. The third critique, which has emerged sort of, and I'll call it the post-9/11 critique, says actually U.S. foreign assistance isn't tied enough to U.S. foreign policy goals. And the paramount U.S. foreign policy goal in the post-9/11 era is keeping ourselves safe from terrorism and violent extremism, and therefore all money that we spend, all programs that we have, need to be looked at through the lens of how are they helping produce societies around the world that are less likely to produce terrorists that threaten us. Now, each one of those critiques, as I say, has some elements of truth to it, and I think the aid community and the people who love it have spent too much time wishing each of those critiques away, frankly, even though each of them is, I believe, fundamentally wrong. But they suggest also some real confusion about what aid actually is. What it is, what it isn't, what it does, what it's supposed to do, what we're promising the American people it will do, what we're promising the recipients it will do. And, Carrie has already laid this out, and I'll put a little bit more of an edge on it because that's the joy of not being in government. But we ourselves are very often trafficking in mixed messages about those things, and we need to understand that. So, I, as an advocate, have for years used the same statistics that Carrie used about, 1% of our budget being spent on foreign aid, and that the public thinks it should be somewhere closer to 10%, but that it actually is closer to 25%. So that's really mystifying, and many people hear that, and they just come away from it with a really poor opinion of the American public. And that's actually not right, because as far as we can tell from doing more research, the thought process is actually something like this. Foreign aid is everything that helps other people. Well, these programs that Carrie's talking about help other people. But when we send our military somewhere to get rid of terrorists, that's helping them, right? And it's hurting us, it's costing us money, it's costing us American lives, and we always say that we're doing it to help the next generation of Afghans or Iranians or Iraqis or whomever. So that's foreign aid. And then, as Carrie referenced, there's now, in the post-9/11 era, an enormous amount of money that flows through the Pentagon into what used to be called humanitarian post-conflict assistance that development bureaucrats, people who have long experience in country, don't control, that the Pentagon controls for the specific purpose of making things easier and safer for our soldiers to be on the ground and do the job that they're there to do. But if you're a person sitting in Colorado or Virginia or whatever, that sure sounds like foreign aid to you. You hear that your cousin in the Marines is building wells in Afghanistan. Well, that sure sounds like foreign assistance, even though it doesn't meet the strategic, targeted, directed community buy-in criteria that Carrie laid out. So that's where the public is getting this idea that because whenever you turn on the TV, you see an American soldier off someplace digging a well, helping a kid. So that's all mashed in as foreign aid in the public mind. And again, not entirely incomprehensibly, if you don't have a clear sense of what is foreign aid for. And we have actually a pretty core debate still, I think, about how much do we do foreign aid because it's the right thing to do. Which is, certainly what the story that Carrie told would suggest is what many of us who come to this field from a faith-based perspective, certainly those of us grounded in the Judeo-Christian traditions, grew up with the idea that those who have much is demanded. But that has never been, and is certainly not now in the post 9/11 era, the rationale behind U.S. foreign assistance. And there was a very interesting debate about this at the beginning of the Obama administration, which we can get into in the Q&A if people are interested. But basically coming down to the decision that was made is that the U.S. gives foreign aid because it's in our enlightened self-interest. Because it's in our enlightened self-interest to have healthy countries with healthy economies we can trade with, to have healthy populations that don't breed disease and pass them on to us, and to have countries with a level of social stability, dignity, and hope such that they don't breed violence, extremism, terrorism that also come back to bite us. And those are all actually perfectly good strategic principles for a country to engage in. But, and Carrie can speak some more to this, or Judith may as well, there is also a fair amount of research that suggests that actually aid works better when the recipients don't think they're part of your grand plan. But actually, aid works better when the recipients think that it's about them and not about you, which, makes sense in your own life, just on an individual level if you think about it. So, I would argue, and since I have the luxury of not being in the administration, that we haven't quite yet hit the sweet spot of being able to explain to our fellow citizens that it's not naively throwing money out windows, down rat holes, et cetera, that it is in our self-interest, but that actually part of our self-interest is altruism. That is our self-interest lies in being altruistic and in doing what's good for other people. And this ties back into a much larger debate that I think you're seeing play out in this presidential election about how the U.S. should act in the 21st century world overall, and whether the kind of power that we have now requires that when we work with others, we consider their views and preferences in ways that can sometimes be painful or unpleasant for us, or whether we still have so much power that we can work with others and we can still tell them what they want. And that, a great many of the debates, we're not having a big debate over foreign assistance in this election, although, we got 6 months to go, anything could happen. But the foreign policy debates we are having, Iran, Israel, how to deal with democracy, how to deal with China, are really all about should the UN continue to exist, should we follow John Bolton and lop a couple stories off it, are really all about when you want to work with other people, do you have to take their views into account? And this is where, we have the intent to do that, and you heard Carrie talk about principles and reforms, but we're not there yet. And we're not there yet for a couple of reasons. And one is, and this is where I say the really obnoxious, you can tell I'm not in government thing. One is that you've all heard of the military-industrial complex. Well, we also have an aid-industrial complex. And there's a whole lot of groups, and this is not even a bad thing necessarily, because you want to have experience and you want to have institutional memory over time. But we have a whole lot of groups, both in government and out of government, that are very invested in things going on the way they've always gone. And as I said, it's been very hard to go to that community and say, look, we know you're constantly terrified about, Senator X slashing your budget by 25%, but you've also got to change in these fundamental ways. And we've missed those opportunities time and again, and we have to be honest with ourselves. At the same time, and Carrie referenced this quite specifically, again, the folks in Congress who have to face the voters every 2 or 6 years, the folks, Elizabeth doesn't get a vote. No. And the people who get a vote are the people who are employed when their rice is sold in countries that already produce rice, or are sold when we pay a 20% premium to ship relief supplies on a U.S. airline, or are employed when 40, 50% of an aid, 80, 90% of an aid contract in Afghanistan goes to Washington-based contractors. And if that sounds like the Pentagon to you, it should. And you should also be aware, this is very interesting, as there's increased pressure on the Pentagon budget, many of the contractors you know and love from $1,000 toilet seats are moving into the development realm. So we're going to see more of this rather than less in the future, I'm afraid. So those are two really big sets of problems that we all have to be honest about. And when we get into this aid, don't aid conversation, it's really easy to get mad about, oh, you know, conservatives are racist and they hate Africans and, you know, whatever. But we have an aid structure in the U.S. that was developed in the 1950s and 60s for a Cold War world, and a world where the gap between the northern countries giving the aid and the southern countries receiving it was enormous. And, you know, as Carrie said, when it comes to cell phones, now you encounter better technology in some places in the developing world than you do here. As you'll hear from Judith, there are now all kinds of other major centers of aid giving that aren't connected to the U.S. government, both public entities, but also, you know, Bill Gates gives more money to Africa every year than quite a few wealthy countries do. A company like, when we were working on actually getting antiretrovirals to Africans, I was working for the One Campaign, which is the nonprofit that Bono started, and he had this wonderful line that he liked to say that if Coca-Cola can deliver chilled drinks all over Africa, don't tell me we can't deliver chilled vaccines all over Africa. So, you know, again, you may have a certain idea about the role of government in aid and in state formation, but if the most powerful actor you have in a region is Coca-Cola or GM or an oil company, and this is already happening on the ground, and again, some of it's not very good what's happening on the ground, but our thinking about aid and our talking about it has to take that into account. So I promised that mine would be the explicit and bomb-throwing segment of the panel, and I will now turn it over to Judith to talk about the outside the U.S. perspective.